Okay, so I just want to go through a couple of things on Express. This is where we left things off. So our big takeaway here is that we can require other libraries. And what's important here and what you don't really know until you end up looking at the documentation to the library is what you're actually bringing in to the library. So, in this case, you could see how we're using it, that this chalk object that comes in here has some methods that we can end up using. And the methods are different colors. And again, this is something you can find out. You wouldn't know it right off the bat, but this is what you'll find out when you end up looking at the documentation. The next thing that I want to do is just look at what it means to be asynchronous and what that's all about and why it's so important with JavaScript. And these are all things that we're going to end up using in the workshop. So aside from doing this, what I want to do here is right up here is there's an FS module. And there's an FS module that allows me to read a file. And the file that I'm going to read, first of all, if I went to do this, I'd run into a problem because FS doesn't exist. There are certain modules that are actually packaged with Node. When you install Node, this is something that it comes with. These are all objects that interact with your file system. So you have the ability to read a file. Now the file that I want to read, and let's actually just see if this works, is going to be my foo.js. Let's just see what happens when we run this. I still have this thing running here. Nothing happened. Okay. Let's find out why. Well, the reason why nothing happened is that there are methods that there are objects, or how should I say, APIs that end up making asynchronous calls. And usually they end up making asynchronous calls because there's something expensive going on. JavaScript is single-threaded. Okay? The Node environment is not single-threaded. So there are ways to run multiple threads, but what ends up happening here is that there's this event loop that is sort of constantly running your code, and it basically runs your code until it's done. But if you end up having callbacks here, or something that's asynchronous, what happens is that this FS module will actually go and spawn another thread. And when that thread is done, it basically notifies the event queue, or calls a function on the event queue or something along those lines to specify, hey, look, I'm done and here are my results. Now, again, you don't have control over when that happens. Again, you're hoping that you're using a library where it's not going to take an infinite amount of time to happen, because that can be problematic. But again, you don't have control over it. It's not something that you can control, like the set timeout or something like that, although that's asynchronous as well. Now, a lot of these asynchronous functions, one of the ways that you recognize them is that their callbacks end up taking two properties. They take an error and they take a result. Let's see if this worked. We'll say console.log err. Let's see if we got an error. And again, we're running nodemon, which is nice. Tell us we didn't have an error. Okay, that's good sign, because either we're going to have an error or we're going to have some data. Let's see what our data looks like. So that looks kind of interesting. What does that mean? Well, remember we were talking actually about encoding? What ends up happening here is that we end up getting this text back, but we're not specifying what the encoding is. So what you can do here, there's a second parameter that you can, there's two ways to get around this, but this sort of goes back to, basically we've got these ones and zeros stored, and we've got to say, hey, look, this is what the encoding is of our file. And this is just a regular file. If we say toString, we'll actually see our file. But this is kind of just a cute thing here when we say, when in doubt, use UTF-8. So there's a Another parameter that you could put on here, if you specify what the encoding is, you'll actually get it back in UTF-8. So, but the main thing here is, let's say that we did this. We don't have a JSX file. So now our result is undefined. What does our error look like? Okay. So our error is an object here that tells us, in fact, hey, look, here's your error, and there's no such file, and there's some error codes that you have as a result. So when you do something asynchronously, there's no guarantee that it's going to end up passing. The other thing here is that just look at the order, things that come back. If I do this, I put in result. Okay. Notice that all these things happened, and then I got that call back. And that's because when this runs, this function is not going to get called back. The way that I want you to think about it is that, when we ended up attaching event handlers to a button, right, that event handler doesn't get called until someone ends up clicking on the button. Now, it's a little bit different because someone might never click on the button. This is a little bit different in that we are asking to read the file. But again, since this is something that's going to be a memory, what's the word that I'm looking for? What we don't want to have happen is we don't want to have our single thread, or at least the way that this library is written, we don't want to block things until we get that file back. That's going to give us a terrible, terrible performance with this. Now, if you really said, hey, look, you know what? I don't want to do anything until I end up getting this file back, you could do something like this, which is to specify, hey, look, I want to read this thing asynchronously. And I don't do this too often, so I got to be honest with you. I'm not positive of the syntax, but I think when you do this, you can now read this file. Now, I didn't do anything with the results that I got, but let's say I'll do console.log text. Now I've read my file and I'm printing it out in magenta. So those are two different things. And you should notice that that happens first, right? I mean, that's blocking. What I'm doing is I'm telling this FS library, hey, look, you have two different ways to do this. Now, again, if I'm dead in the water before I get these results back, sure, I could do it synchronously, but it's not a good practice to do. It's not something that you want to do. You don't want to have your one thread that's running blocking everything. So, this would more likely be what we had before, which is read file, in which case we're going to pass a function, and I'll say ERR or text. Again, this is an indication. If you looked at the documentation, this would be an indication that this is running asynchronously. It might not be. I mean, not all passed-in functions end up getting are asynchronous. So here, if we end up doing let's say if error log error in red, and we'll say, you can do this just to say, hey, look, I'm getting out of here. And here we could say log text in green, right? So go back here, we should see our text in green. And if we were to go over here and put in a file that doesn't exist, we would see our error in red. So that's important. And let's also just make the distinction. Don't think that every callback function is in fact asynchronous. If I was to just put another function here, call me function text, I'll say log text, do this in blue. Now this would fail, of course, because I have no call me function, but if I go and put my call me function here, and I'm passing in a function, I'm going to immediately call that function back. And let me just call that function back with a new date and just show the current date. All right. So if I scroll up here, you can see that this is synchronous here. Let's actually just figure out what that undefined is here. Gonna have a console.log happening somewhere. Here's our date. Here's our function. It'd be nice to figure out where that undefined is coming from. Let's comment a few things out. Oh, I'm sorry. I still have this text value here, which when we read this asynchronously, it doesn't return anything. That's actually such an important point to note. If you end up writing asynchronous code, and you will, right? We're going to write code that we might end up reading from a database. We might be making an HTTP call. When we do that, okay, asynchronous functions don't return anything. Okay, because when we do get into promises, we're going to find out that promises are going to better manage our asynchronicity. But when we call fs read file, what could possibly be returned, right? I mean, we're passing in our callback function. So when we say text equals fs read file, it doesn't really make any sense. So let's take that out. When we take that out, right, we'll get an error because text doesn't exist. And let's just get rid of this line and we'll get rid of our undefined. Okay. So this takes us, tells us a little bit about asynchronicity. I want to do one other thing here, which is to introduce you to the module system where you could create your own modules. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a function and I'm going to require logger. And I go here, and this breaks up because logger doesn't exist. So I go over here and I say, well, I'm going to create a file called logger, perfectly legitimate to do. Okay? I go back here, and it's still not going to work. Okay? And the reason why it can't work is that if I did have in my node module folder, there was a logger folder, I would be okay, but there isn't. This is code that I'm going to write. So when you want to actually load a module that you wrote, you need to give the path to the module. And so this is basically specifying, hey, look in my current directory for this file. If it was up one level, we could say .. /. But this says look in the current directory for logger, okay? And this works, and logger really doesn't do anything. Now, let's say that I'm going to comment out this log. But my goal is to put it in this logger. And I'm going to say, no, this is actually going to return to me, when I call my logger, it's going to return to me a log, which I'm going to use. And it blows up because I don't have a log. Nothing is actually returned from here. So how do we pull something in from a module? I mean, you might think that you could do this, and this would be totally legitimate based upon the JavaScript that you've written, that this would work. You might think, hey, this is great. I mean, I did this with testing. It worked fine. Okay? It doesn't work. Log still isn't in function. And let's just look and see where this might be happening from. By the way, you notice that this is actually never getting called. And what we can do here is, if we want to, we have a way of exporting data. So the module system, the require system is great because what ends up happening is that when require gets called, underneath the covers, this file ends up getting loaded, and there's a couple of objects that will end up getting passed in here. So there's two objects that you have. There's a module object, and you can specify, hey, look, what I'm doing is I'm exporting this log. And so now we have this function that we're exporting. And when we have this function, now we have something we could call, but we still run into a problem because chalk isn't defined. So it's really, really important to note that there's no overlap between these files, right? This file is dependent upon log, and we actually have chalk that we're using in the other file. Now, I could keep it here, but I'm not using it at all here. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go back into Logger, and I'm going to paste this in. Now, this is going to work the same way that it did before. Now, there's a couple of ways that you can end up importing things. Right now, what we're saying, and I also just want to be clear about one other thing. I use required twice. Sometimes you require something just to have something run. Now, again, nothing is going to change here. This is going to work exactly the same as it did before. But I just want you to see that if I do a console.log here, I'm going to see something. And let's actually, I'm going to kill this, and I'm going to clear my screen out, and I'm going to run this again. Okay, so I ran this again. I want you to see that loading log only happens once. Now, so what ends up happening, I mean, if you sort of think about this behind the scenes, makes sense, because what you're doing, when you end up requiring something, the module system says, hey, look, did I ask for this before? Did I load this before? If I loaded this before, I'm not going to load it again. If I loaded it, I have it, and I'm just going to return it. So, I mean, if we went over here, we could call this whatever we want to. We could call this log if we want to. I'm not doing anything with it. Run exactly the same. And just so you can see this, if I do here, let's do this down here. Let's do a log, and we'll say, does log equal mog? And let's do this in blue. And actually, it's treating this. This is just the way that, instead of actually logging this, let's do this. Let's do console.log, and we'll say log is equal to mog. Are these the same things? Come on, what are you doing to me here? Let's try one other thing. I'll say, how about this? If log is same, and we'll say log equals mog. And let's just see if that does a console.log of true. I'm doing something that's a little strange here. Oh, you know what I'm looking at? I'm sorry. I'm looking at the fact that it's outputting this entire program. So let me actually just comment this out. Let's not log out the text from our file so it's a little clearer. Sorry about that. Okay. So it's telling us log and mog are the same thing. And just to show you, I can actually do this. Log is log exactly the same thing, the same object as mog, and we get true in magenta. So you can export things, and there's 3 different ways to export them. And let me show you a couple of different things you can do. First of all, right now we're just exporting one function. But just for kicks, nothing would prevent me from exporting an object. And when I export this object, I could say, I'm going to export an object called log, and log is going to point to this log function. Perfectly legitimate to do. Now, if I go to run this, I'll get an error because it's telling me log is not a function. And that's true, because now I've imported this thing, and log, let me get rid of mog, and let me get rid of this and this. And what I want to see here is that, yeah, I'm bringing in my log, and let's just say, hey, look, we're bringing in logger. And now I'll say, hey, log really is loggers log, right? I am able to export this object. Again, whatever I want to expose, I really need to export. So instead of exporting this function, I'm going to export this object. And now we should be back right to where we started from. And you have the ability to export anything you want to. What if I wanted to export a function? Let's call it redlog. So redlog is going to be a function. We're going to pass in some text. That's kind of cute. What we'll do is when we end up calling redlog, we'll say log text red. Kind of silly, but again, we're calling a function that's sitting up here, and we're calling it with red. Right now, we're not using redlog, so it wouldn't matter. What if I was to go over back up to here? And on this last one, instead of saying log blue, I'll say, hey, look, logger, red log, hello. Frankly, I could pass blue in here. We'll just ignore it. And you can see the red is now in hello. So you have the ability to export multiple objects. I want to show you one other thing. There's another way that you could end up doing this. There's nothing that prevents you from doing this piecemeal. And actually, if I go over here, I'm going to copy this, I'm going to paste it, and I'm going to say module.export log equals log, and module.export redlog, and I'll go over here and I will copy this function, and I'll bring this up here. Perfectly legitimate to do, so that you have the ability to, and let me get rid of this, I don't need it anymore. You have the ability to do things piecemeal. So, in other words, maybe you're calling some functions to generate these other things that you're exporting. This would be totally fine to do. Okay. Now, you could even do it one other way. I know these are 3 different ways, and I know that this can be a little bit confusing, but it's worth noting. You'll see it, and you might run into a problem. You also have the ability, there's actually another object that gets passed here, which is the word exports. So both module and exports get passed. Module has a property called exports, and in fact, module.exports and exports point to the same thing. Why was it set up that way? I don't know. All I know is that this will give us the exact same result. So you say, all right, well, that's pretty good. How about if that does the same thing, then, I liked it a little bit more when I had just the one object that I was exporting. I liked it, let me change this so that I'm going to say that exports, just like I had it before, but instead of module exports, I'll just say this is going to equal log and red log. And we're going to wrap this up in a minute, but red log is going to be this function. And you think this is great. I had module exports, but what do I need that module exports for? And you test this out. And it does. Well, let's see. Let's make sure that it's dying for the right reason, which it might not be here. Okay. Hold on. It's not dying for the right reason. This is what I'm exporting, what I think I'm exporting. And it dies. And the reason why it dies has to do with how objects are passed by reference. If you have an object, you have the total ability to manipulate that object. And you had your module object, and module had an exports, and you could modify the module object. You could modify the module exports, and you could modify exports. There was nothing that prevented us from doing, exports foo equals whatever. What you can't do is you can't override an object. This would be the equivalent of thinking that you can pass an object to a function and you could change that, you could set it to a new reference. And I could give you a simple example of it. You know, if we ended up opening up JSBin, and we look at JSBin, I'll just give you a regular JavaScript example, which is sort of similar. If we had a function that's passed in an object, you can modify the object. We do this all the time. This is like one of the first things you did in text first. We could say object.foo equals bar. And if we call, let's give this a name. And if we call foo is our object, and if we call foo with our object, and then we console.log it, and we put our output here, that's fine, doesn't mind that. We modified an object. But do I think I could really do something like this? Imagine if I thought, hey, why don't I do this? Why don't I give it a new, hey, this object's coming in by reference. Let me just change what it's pointing to. Is equals buzz. Now, when I do this, what you see is I still have my empty object here. And that's because what I did was I basically clobbered the object. You can't, if I pass an object in here and I say, hey, look, this variable is now pointing to a new object. Well, this object still exists and this reference still exists. But here, what I'm doing is I'm basically clobbering it, and that's the same thing that you're doing here when you just modify the exports object. So, you know, this is the one no-no to do. And we sort of saw that a little bit when maybe we were doing stuff with our linked list, and, you know, I said, hey, look, before you end up overriding what this head is pointing to, you better end up getting your value. Because again, you don't want to just override it, because when you override it, you're going to end up losing it. I mean, that's what we're doing inside this function. You know, inside this function, we are obliterating whatever object was pointing to before with something else. I mean, if it turned out that object had some other stuff on it, and that's not good, I would do that. If we do that, you know, there's no way that I can assume that if I went in here and said console.log object.foo, right? I overrode it. It's not defined anymore. I clobbered it when it came in here. So you can't just reassign an object. You could take an object's properties and modify them, but you can't say, hey, look, this variable was pointing to something. I'm just going to switch it and make it point to something else. That's not an option. You rephrase that. No, you can do that. You can have it point to something else, but that thing you were pointing to before, if you don't have a reference to it, then it basically disappears. So that's kind of what's happening here. And so in this case, we can get this to work again, and we're back in business. So that's going to wrap it up for what we need to talk about with Node, what you need to do with it. I think that the workshop should be self-explanatory. You can start taking a look at, and I will post this up online. What's up?